The president hasn't made any military threats going into the summit, as you know, but Senator Lindsey Graham, your colleague, he wants an authorization for the use of military force in case the talks fail. Do you think President Trump has taken the military option off the table, and would you vote for such an authorization for the use of military force?
Absolutely not. Lindsey Graham is a danger to the country by even proposing ideas like authorizing war with Korea. My goodness. So that should be something that is seen as naive and seen as something that really serious people shouldn't even really be discussing.
You're calling a fellow Republican senator a danger to the country. I want you to elaborate.
Well, if you've watched over time, I think what you've seen from Lindsey Graham is basically a naive worldview where he believes that war is always the answer, and that also means that expenditures for war are always the answer. And so I think that's bankrupting us as a country, but it's also gotten us involved in dozens and dozens of war where it's not really clear what the American interest is in those wars. And I think sometimes the reaction to our involvement in those wars has actually been worse than had we not been involved at all.
At the same time, President Trump is expressing great optimism about his personal relationship that's going to unfold with Kim Jong-un.
This is CNN Breaking News.
The breaking news tonight, President Trump and North Korea's Kim Jong-un now just 3 hours away from their historic meeting in Singapore. But changes to the plan continue. CNN's confirmed that Mr. Trump has moved up his departure from Singapore now by 12 hours. We'll talk about it with Senator Rand Paul of the Foreign Relations Committee. And our specialists and analysts are also standing by. First, let's go to our White House correspondent, Caitlin Collins. She's in Singapore for us right now. Caitlin, the eyes of the world are on this meeting that's about to take place.
They are, Wolf. It's a meeting that could make history. And though it's 6 p.m. there back in Washington, it is 6 a.m. here in Singapore. And President Trump is up and tweeting right on schedule as he usually is. This time it's about North Korea, essentially a teaser of that sit down with Kim Jong-un. The president writing, quote, meetings between staff and representatives are going well and quickly, but in the end, that doesn't matter. The president says we will all know soon whether or not a real deal, unlike those of the past, can happen. So the president there teasing his meeting with Kim Jong-un that happens in just 3 hours from now, a meeting that the president said he'll know within 1 minute whether or not Kim is serious about denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. Just hours before a handshake and a sit-down that could make history, President Trump and North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un publicly expressing confidence. While the normally reclusive dictator took a late-night stroll in front of the cameras. This as the White House announced that the president will leave Singapore more than 12 hours earlier than expected. But questions remain about whether or not North Korea is willing to commit to denuclearization. President Trump's top diplomat, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, telling reporters that the prep work is done. Now it's up to the leaders.
President Trump is going into this meeting with confidence, a positive attitude, and eagerness for real progress.
Pompeo vowing the United States won't repeat past mistakes.
The United States has been fooled before. There's no doubt about it.
While moving closer to language used by Pyongyang, repeating that the White House wants
the complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of the Korea Peninsula.
Mentioning the entire peninsula is significant because it could include the U.S. presence there. Pompeo declined to say if the summit could affect the 25,000 U.S. troops in South Korea.
I'm not going to get into any of the details of the discussions that we've had to date.
Only noting
we're prepared to take what will be security assurances that are different, unique, than have been provided, that America's been willing to provide previously.
And while only hours away from a historic summit, President Trump is also dealing with fallout from his last one, refusing to let go of his feud with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau at the G7, dispatching his top aides to defend him in the fight over tariffs.
He really kind of stabbed us in the back.
There's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump.
Quite a departure from what the president said before he left Canada.
The relationship that I've had with the people, the leaders of these countries has been, I would really rate it on a scale of 0 to 10, I would rate it a 10.
Trump lashing out after seeing these comments from Trudeau.
Canadians were polite, we're reasonable, but we also will not be pushed around.
In Singapore, Pompeo seemed agitated when asked if the feud could affect negotiations with North Korea.
I came here today, here in Singapore, to talk about North Korea.
Downplaying the rift between the U.S. and one of its closest allies.
There are always irritants in relationships. I am very confident the relationships between our countries, the United States and those G7 countries, will continue to be move forward on a strong basis.
Now, Wolf, the president is up. He's tweeting several times, once about the stock market, another about the meeting. He's saying that right now, I'm actually going to read you this tweet, Wolf, that the president just sent out minutes ago, saying on Twitter, he's not only talking about this meeting with Kim Jong-un, also tweeting about the stock market, the unemployment rate, then saying, quote, "The fact that I'm having a meeting is a major loss to the United States, say the haters and the losers." He said, "We have hostages, testing, research, and all missile launches have stopped. And these pundits who have called me wrong from the beginning have nothing else they can say. We will be fine." That, Wolf, that confidence from the president coming about this sit down with Kim Jong-un, as his own Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has failed to say if the North Koreans have offered any concrete commitments about whether or not they are committed to denuclearizing. That is something we'll likely find out in the coming hours, Wolf.
All right, Caitlin, thank you. Caitlin's in Singapore for us. Let's get some more on all the remarkable events unfolding right now. Our chief national security correspondent, Jim Sciutto, is also in Singapore for us. Jim, is there any reason to believe this summit will not go forward at this late point, less than 3 hours away?
Well, with 3 hours to go, that would be a remarkable development. It looks like, and with the president's expressing that kind of confidence he is on Twitter, it looks like the meeting's going to go forward. But the meeting going forward is one thing. The question is, what do the two sides agree to? These last 24, 48 hours, the work has been on a written statement of some form to put into words, to put on paper the commitment that both sides are making to each other. And the question is, how far do they go? You heard from Secretary Pompeo just within the last 24 hours that the U.S. side is still waiting to hear if North Korea, in his words, is sincere about being willing to denuclearize. That's a remarkable question to raise less than a day before, now 3 hours before, the leaders of those two countries sit down. It appeared at that point they did not have that commitment. So we're going to have to look at the wording of that statement to see how far they're willing to go. And of course, whatever words are down on paper, the real test is going to be following through on those commitments going forward. But it was also interesting, I have to say, Wolf, as I heard Caitlin read off that last tweet from the president, he's referencing things that have already happened, certainly important things, the release of the hostages, the fact that they're sitting down. Is he adjusting expectations to some degree to focus on the positive things that have happened already in light of questions about what they're going to, substantively agree to in this statement? We don't know, but let's see as they sit down, and let's see what is in that final statement.
Let me read that tweet that the president just posted. The fact that I'm having a meeting is a major loss for the USA. The haters and losers. We have our hostages, testing, research, and all missile launches have stopped. And these pundits who have called me wrong from the beginning have nothing else they can say. We will be fine. The president also finding some time to report on Twitter just a few moments ago as well. The stock market is up almost 40% since the election, with $7 trillion of U.S. value built throughout the economy. So he's up in the morning. It's already Tuesday morning there. He's tweeting extensively already. How significant, though, is it, Jim, that the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, is now saying he wants denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula?
It's enormously significant, Wolf, because what does that mean? That would mean not only that North Korea give up its nukes, but that the U.S. Commit to no nukes on the Korean Peninsula. Of course, our closest ally, one of our closest allies in the world, South Korea, part of their security is based on the U.S. nuclear umbrella, and not just whether there are U.S. nukes deployed on the peninsula, but you have U.S. nukes on submarines in the seas around the Korean Peninsula. You have nukes that can be deployed on U.S. military aircraft based in Japan, in Guam. Is that a concession that the U.S. side is willing to make that would be quite a concession, because it would not only affect North Korea's sense of security, but South Korea's sense of security as well. And then, of course, the other question is what happens to those 28-some-odd thousand U.S. forces that are on the Korean Peninsula. The president himself has raised the possibility of withdrawing those forces. That would be remarkable as well. And keep in mind, those forces are not just about North Korea. Those forces are a show of power, a show of force for China as well. It's about a U.S. military footprint in the region. So these are things to watch. How much does the U.S. give? And remember, yes, North Korea has suspended tests, etc., but it has not made any hard, lasting commitments yet. That'll be the real test.
We'll watch it together with you, Jim Sciutto in Singapore. Forrest, thank you. Let's get some more on the breaking news. Joining us now, Republican Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. He's a key member of the Foreign Relations and Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committees. Senator, thanks so much for joining us. And let me get quickly to North Korea. What do you want President Trump to get out of this first historic meeting with the North Korean leader?
You know, I don't think we should have expectations that are too high. I think dialogue alone is a success. We've never had dialogue from the head of our country to the head of their country. So this is a big step forward, just having dialogue. What we get out of it, I think denuclearization is obviously what we want. They've suspended testing. That's good. We've gotten some hostages back. That's good. So I think these are all good small steps forward. I think there's a possibility we could get the symbolic ending of the war from the 1950s between the North and the South. I think that is symbolic, but also would show a thawing in tensions. But I think ultimately what people want is that they would give up their nuclear ambition. That's a big ask. In order to get that, we'll have to have something very verifiable and would have to be over a period of time with inspections. So I'm not so sure we get that immediately, but I think the conversation is much better than having no conversation. If
the North Koreans do what the U.S. wants, Secretary Pompeo is promising what he called unique security assurances for the North Koreans. So what concessions would you be comfortable with in terms of American military power in the region? For example, reducing the U.S. troop level, removing nuclear-capable submarines and bombers from the Korean Peninsula. Would you be comfortable with all of that?
I think everything should be on the table, including removing our troops. But I would say that that would have to do with verifiable denuclearization, and that really, since it takes time to do some of these things and it takes time to believe that your adversary will actually do them, that I think that there should be a gradual lessening of tension, a gradual lessening of sanctions, a gradual lowering of troops. I think you could even have an international force. You could have Chinese troops as part of an international force that would be a stabilizing and reassuring presence. But the bottom line is you can't give everything up front. And so I think a good deal gives things gradually, and I wouldn't give any taxpayer money. I think the offer of economic assistance would be through trade and not through actually direct assistance, but through opening our trade to them.
Yeah, the president has said repeatedly over the past few days he wants South Korea, Japan, China to invest in North Korea. He says the United States is not going to spend any money over there. Can American allies, Senator, South Korea and Japan, for example, trust that President Trump will represent their interests in this meeting? As you know, they're very nervous right now.
I think ultimately any agreement has to be between North Korea and South Korea. I mean, we're part of the process because we were part of the war going back, 60 some odd years now. But ultimately, South Korea has to directly negotiate with North Korea. And I think what you've seen is South Korea is actually very open to negotiations. And in fact, in some ways, South Korea has been pushing it forward, by having meetings there in Korea. So no, I'm not of the belief that the U.S. will trample on South Korea's rights. I think ultimately only any real peace comes from an agreement between North Korea and South Korea.
The president hasn't made any military threats going into the summit, as you know, but Senator Lindsey Graham, your colleague, he wants an authorization for the use of military force in case the talks fail. Do you think President Trump has taken the military option off the table, and would you vote for such an authorization for the use of military force?
Absolutely not. Lindsey Graham is a danger to the country by even proposing ideas like authorizing war with Korea. My goodness. So that should be something that is seen as naive and seen as something that really serious people shouldn't even really be discussing.
You're calling a fellow Republican senator a danger to the country. I want you to elaborate.
Well, if you've watched over time, I think what you've seen from Lindsey Graham is basically a naive worldview where he believes that war is always the answer, and that also means that expenditures for war are always the answer. And so I think that's bankrupting us as a country, but it's also gotten us involved in dozens and dozens of war where it's not really clear what the American interest is in those wars. And I think sometimes the reaction to our involvement in those wars has actually been worse than had we not been involved at all.
At the same time, President Trump is expressing great optimism about his personal relationship that's going to unfold with Kim Jong-un, and he's calling the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, quote, very dishonest and weak. You heard his advisors, Peter Navarro, for example, say there's a special place in hell for Trudeau, and Larry Kudlow, his economic advisor, saying Trudeau stabbed the president in the back. Do you believe those types of personal attacks advance U.S. interests?
Not really. And what I would say about trade with Canada is let's stick to the facts. We have a very mutually beneficial trade with Canada. Are there some places in that trade where Canada's doing things unfair? Yes, on dairy and lumber, Canada's doing something. So let's isolate in on the problem, which are at least two different segments of our economy where we want to sell things to them and they're closing the door and protecting their economy from our goods. Let's work on those and let's have some tough negotiation. But let's don't discount that on 80–90% of the different industries we have pretty free and open trade, and it's a great benefit to the United States to trade with Canada. So I guess I would approach it a little bit differently, but I'm not completely discounting that the president and his team have a point, particularly on dairy and lumber, that there is some Canadian protectionism.
As you know, according to the Office of the U.S. Special Trade Representative, the U.S. has a trade surplus with Canada when you add in goods and services, a trade surplus of what, $17.5 billion. So I'm not exactly sure why the president is so angry at Canada. Are you?
Well, like I say, overall trade is good with Canada. You're right. I think it's mutually beneficial to both countries. There are a few isolated areas where it could be better. Dairy, lumber, and a few other things. And we need to see, is there anything they're complaining about on their end that we are protecting? And maybe there could be a negotiation where we could make trade better. But I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I wouldn't say we're going to threaten all trade or try to ratchet up tariffs with Canada, because by and large, Canada is a great neighbor to have, and we have done very well. Both countries have done very well having open borders for trade.
Let me put those numbers back on the screen because I misspoke as far as the trade surplus with Canada. When you add services and goods, it's an $8.4 billion surplus that the United States has with Canada, our neighbor to the north. Senator Paul, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The breaking news continues next as we